Hi, my name is Lorena Miranda Cardenas, and I chose to do my literature review on minimum wage. I was drawn to research about minimum wage because I feel that I am able to see the direct impacts it has on my life, and I never really put much thought into it. So I feel like I am definitely impacting from it firsthand based on my own wages and how I work. So I wanted to see kind of how it was distributed or how they chose to put it off for each state in the United States. So the 5 articles I chose to review are The Minimum Wage as a Redistributive Tool by Richard B. Freeman, Minimum Wage Laws, Are They Overrated by Charles Brown, The Distributional and Efficiency Effects of the Increasing Minimum Wage, a Simulation by William R. Johnson and Edgar K. Browning, Optimal Minimum Wage Legislation by Alan Drazen, and lastly, Higher Minimum Wage May Have Losers by Noam Schieber of the New York Times. Most of the articles I chose have the same ideas and thoughts on minimum wage, but it was interesting to see how they presented their information and what other factors they used to support their research. In the minimum wage as a redistributive tool, Freeman notes that the goal of minimum wage isn't to reduce employment, but to redistribute earnings to low-paid workers. The redistributive effects used depends on the labor market and the redistributive system in which it operates on the level of the minimum and on its reinforcement. Throughout the journal, Freeman focuses on whether or not the minimum wage can accomplish the goal of redistribution and of the efficacy of the minimum compared to other redistributive policies. He finds that the distribution and efficiency effects of a minimum wage depends critically on the social welfare system in which it lives. The joining of minimum wage and in-work benefits are what can redistribute income to low-wage workers. If both are not implemented, then the goal of achievement by an increasing minimum wage will not work. He feels that an appropriately set minimum wage has the potential to do more good than harm and increases greatness of potential for redistributive benefit, but it can also increase the risk of job loss. Charles Brown, in Minimum Wage Laws, Are They Overrated?, explores the effects of minimum wage on employment. He says that the minimum wage above free market equilibrium for unskilled labor moves the economy back along the demand curve, which then reduces employment. However, it can get a little tricky when employment comes into play because there are so many different factors of why one would be unemployed or receiving less than minimum wage. Brown chooses to focus specifically on the employment of teenagers. If one accepts the idea that labor force participation is an increasing function of the average rewards from participating in the labor force, it appears these rewards are reduced for teenagers by the minimum wage. A data table was included in this article, which compared the teenage labor market from 1980 to 1986 in relation to several variables. It concludes that although there was a 20% reduction in the relative minimum wage, it had no positive effect on teen employment. In fact, the employment population ratio for teens was lower after the minimum wage was increased. The effects of the minimum wage on teen employment are smaller than one would have assumed. Brown believes that substituting low-wage teens for low-wage adults and enforcing a sub-minimum can reduce the price of low-wage teens compared to low-wage adults. This would increase teen employment and encourage employers to substitute low-wage teens for other inputs. Much like with employment, minimum wages' effect on poverty and the income distribution is not very large. With incomplete coverage and the fact that most workers in a demographic group earn more than the minimum wage, an effect on the group's employment would be smaller than it would be if the impacts on those affected could be solved. With complete coverage and the fact that most workers in any demographic group earn more than the minimum wage, the effect on a group's employment will be smaller than it would be if the impacts of those directly affected could be isolated. Brown comes to the finalization that minimum wage is overrated by both critics and supporters. In my third article, Johnson and Browning conduct a simulation on the distributional and efficiency effects of increasing the minimum wage. By using a basic competitive model of the low-wage labor market, assuming that all other factors of production are treated as composite in a perfectly inelastic supply, they focus on the efficiency equity trade-off by developing estimates of the income of an increase in minimum wage on the level and distribution of real income across households. The data used in the study emphasize the relation between low wage rates for individual workers and low household income. It is discovered that any gains in wages achieved by a change in the minimum wage are dissipated by the tax and transfer system. The conditions of the simulation are that the elasticity of demand for low-wage labor is assumed to be zero. There is no disemployment effect, no new workers will enter the labor force, and original workers will continue to work the same number of hours. Minimum wage was increased from $2.30 to $2.80. The increase in the minimum wage redistributed income downward, but the net effect remained small. For the lowest decile alone, the net gain was less than 2% of the disposable income. Although there was a gain in aggregate income of the lowest decile, only 15.5% of the households gained, while the rest were worse off than before. When considering both costs and benefits, increasing the minimum wage by 22% had an extremely small equalizing effect on the distribution of household income. Although increasing the minimum wage redistributes income within income classes, the even distribution of benefits across deciles, the small contribution the earnings of the low-wage workers make to total income, and the impact of marginal taxation rates made for a very weak redistributive policy. The final scholarly journal, Optimal Minimum Wage Legislation, by Alan Drazen, presents a model in which wage legislation is optimal. The quality of goods offered in the market, depending on the average wage, is what Drazen explores. It is crucial for individual demanders to have an incentive to undercut the market price because it opens an obvious role for the government maintenance of wages and prices. When wages are increased, firms may find that effective unit labor costs fall if higher wages are attracting higher quality workers and if individual workers' abilities are imperfectly observable. Drazen concludes that minimum wage legislation in support of the preferred equilibrium would be welfare improving relative to the competitive equilibrium. With the same general idea as Charles Brown that minimum wage is not necessarily the best thing to do when attempting to improve living standards for the working poor and reducing inequality, Noam Schieber from the New York Times reports on 2 new studies in higher minimum wage may have losers. The first study, which was conducted by John Horton of New York University, experimented online where employers could post small jobs such as customer service rep or data entry, and workers could propose an hourly wage for completing the job. While workers saw their wages rise, there was little decline in hiring. Horton noticed that when forced to pay more in wages, employers were seeking more productive workers to complete the tasks, so the amount they spent on each job changed much less than the increase in minimum wage. Because of the increase in minimum wage, employers were seeking to replace the lower skilled workers with higher skilled workers. This then causes highly skilled workers to see their wages rise, even above the minimum wage, and results in employers paying a lot more money for the same exact job. The second study explained that some employers may respond to rising minimum wage by simply going out of business. If your business has poor reviews or low-skilled workers, it cannot keep up with rising minimum wages for reasons such that profits and productivity aren't as high as those with highly skilled workers. This article, however, being in the popular press, offered the same ideas as the articles intended for a more educated audience did, but in such a way that the average American could understand. I saw a lot of consistencies throughout all of my 5 articles. I believe that they offered a lot of supportive data in being able to simplify and explain their ideas and opinions, and feel that they are properly advanced their work. If I were to perform scholarly research on a minimum wage myself, I would evaluate differently scholarly journals to see how they differed from my own and in which ways. I would also conduct my own experiments to create different types of research from a perspective that hadn't been considered before. Nicely enough for me, my articles did not contrast each other much. Some of them provided a different aspect to the idea of minimum wage and gave me other factors, however, they really supported each other. This made it easier for me to connect all of the dots and see minimum wage as the bigger picture. I am definitely more confident in my knowledge about minimum wage now than I was before I had began this literature review, and feel that it opened my eyes and my mind to think differently about economics and to actually discover the why of things, not just taking them for what they are. Thank you so much for listening to my literature review. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.